We're Secure Guard Consulting. We do IT audit. Today, we're going to do the Ransomware Self Assessment Tool, and it's abbreviated R-SAT, so RSAT. And in Iowa, the RSAT was sent out by the Iowa Division of Banking in October of last year. Other state agencies have also either sent that same RSAT tool out or some similar tool. Some state agencies have required it. I think in Texas it might be required, whereas others it might be voluntary. But it was really sent out in response to an increase in ransomware attacks. And so it was developed by the Bankers Electronic Crimes Task Force, the state bank regulators, and the United States Secret Service. The Iowa Division of Banking stated in its letter that it was voluntary, but it did mention also, and I quote, that it's meant to be used as a tool to communicate and discuss with your board and the measures you have taken. And so we've generally seen where these things have been released voluntarily that it's a good idea to go ahead and complete them. I think there is some valuable information in there. It's a worthwhile tool, and the Iowa Division of Banking does ask you to report this to the board, and the RSAT tool even has a place there to document that. And so there are a number of states that are working with the U.S. Treasury Department to schedule a tabletop exercise as well, but we haven't seen any information that's been finalized with that, and I think I'm assuming they'll all do it together with the U.S. Treasury Department. The objective of this webinar is hopefully to help in protection against ransomware, but really specifically, the purpose of the webinar is to walk through how to complete the RSAT. And so we got a lot of questions when that first came out in terms of, this makes sense or this part doesn't make sense. And so I'm just going to walk through the entire thing. And so from an audit perspective, when we come in to do our audits, we won't really look to see if it's completed, but if it has been completed, we'll definitely comment that it has been completed. Our focus on the audit will be really questions on whether or not risk from ransomware has truly been mitigated adequately. And so, report. So what is ransomware? We hear a lot about ransomware and discussions about it and how it's impacting local governments, hospitals, and small and medium-sized businesses. And it's easy to fall into the trap where we think ransomware is something different than traditional malware. But truly, ransomware is malware. It's a type of malware. And so all vehicles used to deliver malware apply. So that's phishing, macros within Word documents, malicious websites, watering holes, etc. Ransomware in general is malware that's designed to encrypt files on a device, rendering the files themselves and the applications that use those files unusable. Attackers then demand ransom in exchange for decryption. Ransomware can also include restricting access to systems or exfiltration of data. So exfiltration means removing data from the network. Ransoms are then demanded to allow access to systems or to not expose sensitive or confidential data publicly. One thing all ransomware has in common is that they all demand a ransom in exchange for restored access to your system or your files. Toward the end of this presentation, we're going to be doing a full walkthrough of the Ransomware Self Assessment Tool. Ransomware is important because ransomware is on the rise. It's on the rise for two primary reasons. One, for hackers, it is financially productive. And two, it is relatively easy to execute. If you think about the most simple ransomware type of attack, all it is code that is there to encrypt files on your hard drive. Some key stats that are important to keep in mind when thinking about ransomware. Ransomware costs businesses more than $75 billion per year. The average cost of a ransomware attack on a business was $133,000. And this is where it gets interesting. 34% of businesses hit with malware took a week or more to regain access to their data. And even further interesting, 75% of companies infected with ransomware were running up-to-date endpoint protection. So this is an important stat. 75% of companies infected with ransomware were running up-to-date endpoint protection. To keep in mind, a little later when we talk about traditional antivirus versus next generation antivirus solutions. Ransomware is defined in so many different ways. You can find all kinds of antivirus providers that define it in their own unique ways. We've defined it by two basic standards. One way is by what ransomware does. So file encrypting, non-encrypting, exfiltration, leakware, doxware, mobile ransomware. So file encrypting is that traditional view of ransomware, which encrypts your files and demands a ransom to decrypt those files. Non-encrypting is where hackers are restricting access to your system and displaying a message. Oftentimes it's a pornographic message, and then demanding ransom to allow you access back into your system and remove the message. Then there's exfiltration of data, a more sophisticated version of ransomware, where ransomware has taken the data and pulled it off of your computer or off of your network and then threatens to expose the information in public. And in order to not expose that, they're demanding a ransom. And then it was inevitable. With mobile phones, mobile ransomware has appeared. Another way to define ransomware is by method of attack. So we define that as opportunistic or strategic types of attacks. Opportunistic attacks are really spray and pray attacks. Mass phishing campaigns, compromised websites, malvertising. Really, we don't have any specific targets in mind in an opportunistic attack. It is truly a spray and pray type of attack. Strategic attacks are more targeted attacks. CrowdStrike calls them BGH, big game hunting. So this can be because we target maybe your bank, XYZ Bank, and specifically doing reconnaissance and open source intelligence to facilitate attacks on XYZ Bank. Or it could be as a result of an opportunistic attack which identified potentially sensitive information on the target, causing the hacker then to target that particular organization further. So one quality we do see in these strategic type of attacks is, in addition to encryption, we see an escalation of privileges in order to move laterally on the network and gain further access deeper within the network and possibly even your backups. So how can hackers get into your corporate network? A lot of times we get focused in on siloed areas. We talk about patch management, we talk about antivirus, we talk about those in siloed areas. But I think it's important to get an overall look at how hackers can get into your system, into your corporate network. And so here's a simple childlike diagram, but I think it gets the point across. We have the bank in the middle of the diagram and then all the different avenues, and there could be more, but these are some of the main avenues that hackers will use to get in your system. Phishing is going to be primarily the most common method of gaining access to a network. Phone is there in order to exemplify a phone-related attack where an attacker would call and impersonate your network support vendor and get you to give them remote access or go to a malicious link or even download an attachment and email sent to you. USBs, although a lot of banks disable USB storage devices except for known exceptions, USBs, even when those are disabled as storage devices, there's a tool out there called the rubber ducky. And that rubber ducky will mimic a human interface device. So essentially it'll mimic something like your keyboard that's plugged into USB. And so those attacks are still prevalent and those attacks are still viable attacks. Then obviously there's the internet, which you should have your firewall and your IPS or IDS or IPS/IDS implemented there and fully hardened. And so we're going to assume for purposes of this that you have hardened your firewalls and that you're doing external penetration tests at least annually to prove out that they are properly hardened, and your firewall configuration reviews. There's also FTP, File Transfer Protocol, if you have that, and what controls do you have in there. Going back to the internet, one of the ways that hackers are getting in the system is through remote desktop protocol. So our hope, and if this isn't the case, and it's definitely a question you should go back and ask your network support vendor or even internally to your IT staff, is do we have remote desktop protocol implemented? And if we do, is it only accessible from behind the firewall? Wi-Fi, having wireless access to the corporate network is a risk. It's not an uncontrollable risk. It's definitely a controllable risk, but it's another method that hackers can get in. And then the harder one to control is your third-party providers, third-party vendors with remote access to the bank's network. And so these would be primarily your network support vendors. And then you have external consultants, IT auditors and other types of consultants that come in, and then bring your own device in terms of mobile phone capability, plugging a mobile phone into the bank's network, or even just email access on that mobile phone. So these are all the external points of connectivity. The reason why we show this is sometimes we just lose sight and we only focus in on one or two of these areas. And for purposes of this presentation, we're going to focus in on email. And so email or phishing is going to be the most common way of delivering ransomware. And that's going to be either through a malicious attachment, or it's going to be through a link to a malicious or a compromised website. So again, ransomware is malware. So let's take a step back and look at the flow of data, or the flow of a hack. So we've got the hacker. The hacker sends a phishing email. That phishing email then goes to a user's inbox, and that user makes a decision on whether to click on that link to a malicious website or a compromised website, or to download that malicious attachment. That malicious attachment is now on the computer. It exploits the computer, and at that point it can finish there. It could be a simple attack that's just out to get one computer and apply ransomware to that one computer. And it would do so by encrypting all the files on that hard drive. Or it could go a step further and cycle through the alphabet and try to search for share drives. Your F and G drive, etc. might then be encrypted. Or some of the sophisticated malware is now making lateral moves across the network. It's using traditional methods, and it's using fileless attacks. And then from there, applying ransomware to any of those devices that it encounters as it moves laterally through the network, with the ultimate goal being to infect your backups or to pull data off of your network if it's established positive command and control. So what types of controls do we have as we go through that whole process flow? When the hacker sends that email, we should have strong spam filtering in place. Strong spam filtering is something we define as having good sandboxing capabilities and especially URL analysis capabilities. A lot of the spam filtering solutions will take URLs and detonate them in their own sandboxed environment and then compare them to known malicious URLs, stopping the ones with malicious URLs from coming into your email box. The second thing, and probably one of the most important things and one of the most uncontrollable things, is ongoing information security training. So once that malicious email does get past your spam filtering solution and land into one of the employees' email boxes, are they trained sufficiently enough to detect when it's a malicious email? And so this is done through ongoing information security training and ongoing simulated phishing campaigns. And so information security training, we have seen in the past where regulators were satisfied with annual information security training, but the reality is it should be done much more frequently than annually. We think quarterly is an acceptable time frame to be doing information security training. And a lot of the banks out there have implemented products such as KnowBe4 or similar products so that they can do those types of video training quarterly and then have internal conversations regarding that at staff meetings. And so bottom line is information security training needs to be done more frequently than annually. And then when you look at the Ransomware Self Assessment Tool, the RSAT, it talks about security awareness training programs need to include the following. So ransomware. And so remember, ransomware is a type of malware. Our belief is that you should at least define ransomware for employees, what it is and what it does. But there should be a focus, again, on malicious websites and downloading of malicious attachments. The Ransomware Self Assessment Tool also asks that you include social engineering and phishing, which is the primary method of distributing malware. So your employees' security training program should cover phishing. It should cover hovering over links in order to determine if they're going to some malicious site or an unknown site, as well as what to look out for to identify suspicious emails. So as an example, did the email come from someone I know? Was I expecting the email? Is the email asking me to do something that's out of the ordinary? And then covering phone attacks, in-person attacks, or where a hacker would dress up as pest control and try to gain physical access to the facility, and then USB drop attacks, like we talked about earlier with USB drop attacks. If you haven't disabled USB across the board outside of known exceptions, you should. But even after you have disabled them, there's still some potential for a USB drop attack to be successful. So your training program should encompass this. And then an important note that we see missing in a lot of information security training programs is incident identification and reporting. So what types of things should employees be looking out for? They should be looking out for things like an unusually slow computer or random files deleting, especially after they've just clicked a link or downloaded an attachment. And really, very, very importantly, who to report this to if they do see something happening. And then, last but not least, is testing to ensure effective training has been implemented. So simulated phishing campaigns and other social engineering campaigns. One thing we do suggest at least once during the year is to let employees know that hackers will not be fair in the methods they use to hack the bank. From that perspective, your simulated phishing campaigns will also use these dirtier tactics in order to test whether or not employees are truly being effective after their training is done. We suggest speaking with employees about this so that when you do run simulated phishing campaigns, you don't really have to hold back on those. You can run them as strong as hackers would, which only enhances your information security training programs. Because remember, hackers don't care about fairness. Another thing about information security training programs, it's important to be as creative as possible. And so one thing that we are doing for banks that we serve in the ISO role for this year is we're doing information security escape rooms, or at least virtually within groups, or if we can't go on site, they'll be virtually through breakout sessions through WebEx. And so one example would be to show 15 different emails and have employees identify which emails are malicious. And at the top of each of those emails, there would be a number, and that would translate to a code. The code could even be the number that they're supposed to call when suspicious activity is seen. Another stage would be brute forcing an 8-character password with some clues, possibly from the previous stage, showing how complexity makes things harder. So when we look at that attack flow, we talked about spam filtering, we talked about ongoing information security training, we talked about ongoing simulated phishing campaigns, patch management. Once that user downloads that malicious attachment onto the computer or goes to a malicious link that leads to a hack on that computer, patch management is crucial. As an example, the WannaCry ransomware took advantage of a Microsoft exploit, using an exploit kit to take advantage of a security hole in a system or program. So clearly, we need good patch management. We need to be looking weekly for new Microsoft-related security updates and patches. We need to be looking at a minimum for third-party related patches monthly. And then for virtualized environments with VMware and ESXi as an example, we should be looking at a minimum quarterly. And then when something critical comes out, applying those as quickly as possible. And then to determine how our patch management is doing, to have proper oversight, making sure that we're having internal credential vulnerability scans, and those should be performed at least annually by an independent and qualified audit provider. We are seeing a trend from a lot of banks purchasing their own tools and running those on quarterly. We would definitely be on board with that and recommend that. And so the more frequently you can run it, the better off you will be, as opposed to catching it just annually. So in addition to patch management, antivirus software is huge. And there's going to be a difference between traditional versus next generation antivirus solutions. And so this brings that stat that I emphasized earlier back to mind. When the problem is 75% of companies infected with ransomware were running up-to-date endpoint protection. So traditional antivirus is necessary. But the problem is that it focuses on signatures, and many of the traditional antivirus solutions will only scan files. So what about fileless attacks? These are attacks that run in memory. What about malware or ransomware that won't be caught by traditional antivirus? We estimate antivirus only catching about 30% of the malware out there. What about malware that uses legitimate tools, PowerShell, WMI? These are what we consider abusable features. They're used for legitimate purposes, but they can also be used for illegitimate purposes. So it's very, very hard to disable either of those on a network. And so what this leads to is a difference between indicators of compromise as opposed to indicators of attack. Reactive versus proactive, with traditional antivirus really looking for indicators of compromise or just before compromise, focusing in on definition updates and signatures. One of the easiest ways to explain the difference between indicators of compromise and indicators of attack is if we think about a thief trying to rob a bank. One morning you might come into the bank and see that the vault is open with cash missing. That would be an indicator of compromise. And it's very reactive. It's after the attack has occurred. As opposed to an indicator of attack, where if you look at the behaviors of a thief and you see that a thief first starts their process by casing the bank, doing their reconnaissance, identifying the time and best entry point to get into the bank, and then at night breaking into the bank, and one of the first things they might do is disable the security system, and then go to the vault and use brute force to try to open that combination. These are all behaviors, and they can be seen. And when there's a pattern of behaviors that matches something that would lead to an indicator of compromise, right, actual compromise, that's when the attack should be stopped. And that's what Next Generation Antivirus Solutions do. And so right now, if you only have a traditional antivirus solution, you really should put it on the docket for the year to at least evaluate one. Remember, there are a lot of different compensating controls. When we go through and look at the different types of controls we have in place and the different layers of security, we have spam filtering, we have ongoing security awareness training, we have ongoing phishing campaigns, patch management, a whole host of other controls. But one thing that you should be looking at and at least getting some quotes on or some knowledge about are Next Generation Antivirus Solutions, which are more proactive. They use machine learning and behavioral algorithms to try to identify indicators of attack, to be more proactive in protecting against ransomware as well as other types of malware. And so Next Generation Antivirus Solutions are something that you actually get more value for than what you pay for. And so at SecureGuard, we use CrowdStrike. Other tools that are out there include Sophos Intercept X, Advanced EDR, Cylance, Carbon Black Cloud, McAfee EDR. I think just about every antivirus provider has some type of EDR solution, which is a next generation antivirus solution. And so I would talk to your network support vendors about that and try to get a jump start on at least understanding and evaluating whether those are needed for your network. And so the focus again is on indicators of attack, and I can't overemphasize the stat there. 75% of companies infected with ransomware were running up-to-date endpoint protection. And so when we look through this, again, we see our spam filtering, we see our information security training, we see that patch management is vitally important, that antivirus software, even the traditional version, is important. And then we also see the need to at least evaluate next generation antivirus solutions. The sixth point we want to make is that we should be removing local administrator privileges wherever it's possible. And so this helps prevent a huge variety of attacks. It makes fileless attacks very, very, very challenging. There is an attack out there, it's a ransomware attack, where they simulate a fake software update, prompting the users to enable admin capabilities so that they can then install malicious code. Removal of local admin privileges prevents unapproved code from running. Once a hacker breaches a computer and gains administrative privileges in some way, they will then look to move laterally on the network if they have established positive control. And so it's important to have either a log event monitoring solution or a SIEM solution, at least on your critical servers. So when they hit those critical servers, you have some type of indicators of compromise, whether it's escalation of Windows privileges or creating a brand new domain administrator account. These should all have alerting capabilities that can alert you when these types of activities happen. And then one of the biggest controls out there, and it's the one that's referenced usually first in the long line of different controls, is strong backups. The reason why I put this as number 8 is, if you notice, by the time we get to that backup section, we've gone through so many different layers. Again, we've gone through spam filtering, we've gone through our information security training, we've gone through fully patched systems, running antivirus software, whether it's traditional or next generation. Hopefully we have local administrative privileges removed wherever possible. and there's good alerting capabilities, at least on our critical servers, for either Windows Log Event Monitoring or SIEM. And so SIEM solutions, for those of you that may not have that, involve essentially looking laterally across the network and combining that data with firewall data. So you're looking vertically and looking for and correlating both of those to look for indicators of compromise. So strong backups, some guidance on those is that backups should occur at a minimum daily. They should be stored at some type of offsite location, so either replicated to another branch or replicated using a cloud service like StorageCraft or Datto. The general guidance is that backups should be segregated from the network in some way, and so the Ransomware Self Assessment Tool really points out that they would like to see air-gapped backups. For example, what an air-gap backup means is taking a backup to an external storage device and then unplugging it physically from the network. So there's air between the backup and the network. So if ransomware were to get on the network and move laterally through the network, it would have no chance of jumping over without a network connection to that backup solution. The other option are immutable backups. So many cloud service options, the backups are considered immutable or unchangeable. And so if you are using a cloud-based solution, you'll want to reach back out to that cloud provider and ask them, are those backups considered immutable? And then if you can't air gap, because operationally air gapping is very difficult, and quite frankly, operationally, it's always a judgment call in terms of, do we air gap our weekly backup? Do we air gap our monthly backup? What's our risk appetite in that area? And so, but if you can't air gap and you don't trust the cloud, then you should definitely look at segmenting your backup systems from the network as a compensating control. So one way of doing that is to segment your backup system, implement a single non-standard port for communication, and then time restrict access to that backup. One very, very important point that I do want to point out is that backups should use authentication methods that are different from the network method of authentication. So if you think about a Windows network, if I haven't already compromised your domain admin passwords or credentials in some way, all passwords in a Windows system are stored in a one-way hash. And what a one-way hash is, it's an algorithm where if you take two numbers, and this is just an example, if you take two numbers and you say that the formula is to add them together to come up with an answer, then what's the answer to 1 plus 2? The answer would be 3. Or 2 plus 2, the answer would be 4. Or 10 plus 10, the answer would be 20. So left to right is very easy. Now if we reverse the direction and say that we know the formula is to add two numbers together to get the answer, but I give you the answer of 100, what are the exact two numbers to get here? You have to guess. It could be 50 and 50, it could be 51 and 49, it could be 99 and 1. So this is what's known as a one-way hash. And so in Windows systems, the passwords are stored as hashes. And there's a tool out there called Mimikatz, which captures those hashes and attempts to pass those hashes to other devices in order to authenticate. It's what we call an abusable feature. And so these are things that are there for a reason. It's using the hashes and passing the hashes out. And so, and if we think, has Mimikatz been used in ransomware attacks? The NotPetya and Bad Rabbit ransomware used Mimikatz in conjunction with leaked NSA hacking tools to automate their attacks. This is the reason why I discuss this. Is it's very, very important that we use backup authentications that differ from the network-based mode of authentication. And the reason why is because if someone does capture that hash or gets the outright credentials, they won't be able to access your backups. So the last thing we want to cover is egress filtering. So once a hacker is on the network, in order to establish command and control or positive control, they're going to have to be able to communicate back out. And so we've only seen a handful of banks where we come in and we run internal security assessments and external penetration tests where they are blocking ports going outbound. Traditional firewalls and firewall monitoring companies will block ports that are unused inbound, but leave all 65,535 ports outbound open. And so if we think about a tool, a penetration testing tool like Metasploit. Metasploit, for a lot of their attacks, will use port 4444 for outbound communication. So if you think about it, common sense dictates that 4444 is not used for anything legitimate. So why keep it open? One thing we suggest doing, and it's really a two-phase process to determine what egress filtering should be put into place, outbound communication, is to look at the last 30 days or 60 days of outbound port activity and make a deduplicated list of all the outbound ports that were used. And so you may have 5 or 6 different ports that were used, or you may have 15, however many that were used. But outside of those, every other port should be blocked right away. After that, take a look at that list of deduplicated ports that were used for outbound communication, and then make a decision as to whether those ports should remain open or should be closed. And so the idea is to justify each and every port from the outbound side as well as the inbound side. So when we look at this, these aren't the only controls that banks will implement. There's obviously system hardening procedures, there's inventory management, there's numerous settings within antivirus software that need to be adjusted and set to a strong level. There's passwords, there's expirations, there are lockout procedures, there's timeout procedures. There's a lot of different procedures. And our general controls program is much, much bigger than this, where we ask over 1,500 questions. But these are the top ones that we feel that was worth pointing out. So it's important to look at the flow of the process and the controls that should be implemented. Ransomware doesn't just come down to having strong backups. Strong backups are highly critical to have in place. However, there are a number of other controls that are in place that need to be in place before it even gets to the needing to use the backups. And those are spam filtering, ongoing security awareness training, adequate patch management, proper antivirus solutions in place, removing local administrative privileges, having a log event monitoring or SIEM solution in place, at least for your critical servers. Strong backups are highly, highly important, but again, in the context of all the other controls that are there. And then egress filtering. And then when it comes to cloud access, it's important to implement multi-factor authentication anywhere possible. And a lot of times multi-factor authentication, even in the RSAT tool, they point towards using a soft token, or at least a hard token or a soft token, something where the one-time passcode is pushed to, as opposed to a text-based authentication. And the reason why text-based authentication isn't recommended, although it's better than nothing, is because of the rise in SIM swap attacks. So the SIM card in your phone is what governs where the text messages and phone calls come to. If I call your carrier, if I know you work with Verizon Wireless for your mobile phone carrier, and I call your carrier and I can adequately impersonate you in whatever security codes you have to change things on your accounts, the simplest attack is, hey, you know what, my name is XYZ and I lost my phone. I have a new phone here. We need to swap the SIM card. And then I'm now collecting your text messages. And so that's a SIM swap attack where if you're using text-based multi-factor authentication, I've now compromised. And then anywhere for cloud services that require, where you have administrative access, should require multi-factor authentication. In the case of Office 365, web-based email should really be, for employees, should either be disabled or multi-factor authentication should be used each and every time they're accessing web-based email. And then in the case of mobile phone capabilities, at a minimum, multi-factor authentication should be used, at least by the default Office 365, 14 days. And so what's the impact of a ransomware attack? The impact could be as simple as losing data on one machine. And so if you have backups, good solid backups, that's not going to be a problem. It's going to hurt, but it's not going to hurt near as much as if the ransomware is able to traverse your network and then infect your other backups. Shutting down a bank's network would be catastrophic for the bank. And while it wouldn't be catastrophic necessarily to exfiltrate that data, it would result in significant cost and it would be potentially devastating. And so exfiltration of your data to the public can result in significant cost, or if you have insurance, at a minimum, an insurance claim, which could involve attorney fees, credit monitoring fees, sending letters to all of your customers, regulatory notifications, reputation damage. Depending on state law or what states you're in, there could be attorney general notifications and attorney general actions against you as well. And so before we go and look at the Ransomware Self Assessment Tool, just wanted to note that KnowBe4, and there are other simulators out there, but this is the one that I have played around with. There's a KnowBe4 ransomware simulator tool that you can download that will test your traditional antivirus solutions to see if they're protecting against all the known variants of malware or known variants of ransomware out there. The one caveat I have is if you're using a pure behavioral detection next generation antivirus solution such as CrowdStrike, that simulator results may not be 100% accurate because they're in a siloed environment where they're just looking to mimic the signature updates. The RSAT, and today what we're going to do is go through and try to complete the RSAT with generic information. And so it's divided into 4 different parts: identify and protect, detect, respond, and recover. And so once you've completed all those sections and identified any potential gaps that you might have, or if you don't have any gaps, to provide that RSAT board. And so we have a sample board report that we'll go through. And then if needed, remediate and then represent once that's done. I am going to go ahead and switch to the tool itself. So here's the Ransomware Self Assessment Tool that was sent out by a lot of the state agencies, and in the case of the Iowa Division of Banking in October of 2020. And so the first part to look at populating is just your name and title, your email and phone number, institution name, the date completed. And then here is probably one of the key elements, at least for our examination purposes. And again, it's supposed to be a voluntary tool. And so whether they'll require it or not is really going to be up to the examiners, I think. What we did see is when the FFIEC Cybersecurity Assessment Tool was released, I think FDIC in particular said, we just want you to fill out some type of framework or use some type of cyber assessment tool, whether it's the FFIEC one or if it's CIS controls or if it's NIST. It doesn't really matter to us which one you do. There were other regulatory agencies that said, no, we just want the FFIEC cyber assessment tool completed. And so, again, voluntary has its own meanings. I think you've all been through exams, and voluntary generally means just go ahead and do it. So, but definitely record the date that you reported it to the board. And so in that first kind of grouping of identify and protect, we're going to go through each number. So they asked the question, are the Center for Information Security controls used to mitigate the most common cyber attacks? And so generally speaking, for all the community banks that we have been auditing, the answer is going to be no. Some of the banks that we do work with subscribe to the CIS Top 20 controls. And so it's just another framework, and it's a very useful framework. The FFIEC CAT actually takes information from all these different frameworks and combines them into areas that they feel are relevant to financial institutions. And so this isn't saying you have to go out and do this. It's just saying, are you doing that? And so if we look at, I have this data included in the material that I've sent out to you, and I'm going to resend this out after this call just to make sure everybody on the call has this. But I put a 2020 data breach investigation. It's the Verizon 2020 data breach investigations report. If you go to page 101 of that, you'll see the controls listed out. So they refer to the controls in their report, and they align their entire report according to the CIS Top 20 controls. And so you'll see similarities for things you're already doing. And so the other way to look at that is to go out and Google CIS Top 20 controls, register your name, and go from there. So then they ask what other standard or framework, if any, are used to guide cybersecurity control implementation. So you'll want to make sure that FFIEC CAT stands for FFIEC Cyber Assessment Tool, that's checked and that they're using that and you've completed that. Other ones that are out there is this FSSCC Cyber Security Profile. I can't remember what you can Google this. Bottom line is when you Google this and you go to their what they call ACAT, Automated Cyber Assessment Tool, I can't see any differences between that and the FFIEC CAT tool. I think they're the same. And so then they have NIST. So National Institute of Standards and Technology, they have their NIST controls, whether you're using those or not. And so generally speaking, as community banks, we're going to populate just this FFIEC CAT. And then I add in the other, because your audits are really there to audit against some type of frameworks or standards. Our audits use elements from just about every framework in here. And so we think it's worthwhile documenting that you also use your annual IT general controls review, your internal vulnerability scans, your external penetration tests, and your social engineering campaigns in here as well. And so then they ask the question of, has a gap analysis been performed to identify controls that have not been implemented but are recommended in the standards and frameworks that you use? So all that's really saying is, as you go line by line through the frameworks that you have, was there anything that you're not addressing? And that would be considered a gap that should be either remediated or discussed and accepted by the board. And so in the case of, so how we would document that is, yes, because all of you would have done your IT risk assessment. So IT risk assessment was performed with ransomware risk mitigated to acceptable levels. And so if it hasn't been, that's where you would document what hasn't been done. Also, the FFIEC CAT has been completed and is meeting either maturity levels that are based on your inherent risk. So if your inherent risk is higher, like a moderate, it puts you in the category of needing to meet the evolving declarative statements. But if it's like most community banks, I think regulatory expectations are that just all baseline maturity levels are met. And then you start looking towards your inherent risk to see if you need to meet meeting the evolving category as well. And so definitely if all of your baseline maturity level haven't been met, all the declarative statements in there, then that would be considered a gap that needs to be addressed and remediated. And so, but I would just comment accordingly here, just to provide more detail around the yes. And then cybersecurity insurance isn't a requirement. We know plenty of banks and a lot more are doing so as time goes on, getting cyber insurance policies through their insurance providers. And so if you have one, document yes, and then document the name of that carrier. Or if you don't, document no. A lot of banks have chosen to self-insure. And so I don't think there's a right or wrong answer here. Just depends on your size and risk appetite. And so each device can cost roughly $50,000 to do forensics on, and customer notifications to your entire customer base, along with free credit reporting for all those customers for a year is usually something that adds up in cost. So it's worthwhile looking at. Then the next thing they do is they go through and they're asking you to document all of your critical data. And so my apologies if this isn't big enough. They're looking for you to document all of your critical data. So obviously the top ones are your core processing vendor, network administration, email services, image files, trust, mortgage, loans, investments, right? They're asking you to document whether that's in-house or whether that's outsourced. So really what they're trying to do is they're trying to look at, is ransomware protection in your control or is it in the vendor's control here? And so they do have a section for other critical data, and we listed out some samples because some of these might be different. Could be the same online banking as your core system, but we have seen a trend for a decent amount of banks that are doing different online banking vendors than what their core system vendor is. And so we suggest listing out retail online banking, business online banking. And so sometimes some of you might be using Shazam ACH. Some of you might have made your own portal for business online banking or some other type of portal. So if that's the case, you want to identify that in there for submitting ACH files. Spam filtering solutions. So if you're using a spam filtering solution that's different than your email provider. So for example, if you're hosted on premise for your email services, if you have an Exchange server, but you're using Zix spam filtering, all of your email is technically going out through Zix and coming back in through Zix. And so you'll want to list them as a critical application. And so, and I always hate doing this, is referring back to the risk assessment and finding out what you identified as critical there, and then pulling that into here. But if that's not clear in your risk assessment for whatever reason, definitely just think through if we lost this data, if it had ransomware applied to it, how big of an impact would it have to us? And if the impact is significant or catastrophic, then I would list it out in here. And then just identify whether or not it's in-house or outsourced. So the next question it then asks is, do any third-party vendors, including MSPs, so your network support vendor, do they have continuous or intermittent remote access to the bank's network? And so, or the institution's network. And so the answer will either be yes or no. And in most of the cases, I think it's going to be yes, unless you have in-house IT staff. And so I think usually in banks under 800 million, it's going to be that we do have a network support vendor. And so they ask you to go further and describe the different types of access they have. And so these are just examples, what I have in orange. They're just examples to get you thinking along the lines of what you could put in here. So usually we're going to see that network support vendors have remote access for patch management, network support, etc. And that silent remote access is allowed. And so silent remote access, from our standpoint, how we define that is, do we need to give permission every time for them to be able to get into our systems? And so for patch management, it's usually silent remote access. And so we just talk about the different types of access that they have. And so even if you keep it generic like this, as long as you're documenting it somehow. And then if yes, are controls implemented to prevent ransomware and threat actors from moving from the third party's network to the institution's network via these types of access? And so this is one where you'll probably have to talk to your network support vendor or whatever vendors do have that remote access into the bank's network, and ask them what their controls are. And some examples of what you'd hope to hear back from those vendors is whether they're using some type of antivirus solution or not. We know a lot of them have implemented, kind of similar to us, they've implemented CrowdStrike or some type of next generation antivirus solution. When you hear the words next generation antivirus solution from a vendor, coupled with the words machine learning or artificial intelligence, you should get a relatively safe feeling. At a minimum, your vendor should be using two-factor authentication for remote access to the bank's network. So they have tools like Kaseya, Enable, ConnectWise, different tools out there where when that vendor goes out to the tool to gain remote access to your system, they'll have two-factor authentication through some type of authenticator app. And so you'll want to see some of those responses. Those are huge controls to prevent ransomware from moving from their network onto yours. And then they ask the question, have all third-party vendors with remote access provided an independent audit that confirms these controls are in place? And so what we've seen is a lot of network support vendors won't do SOC audits unless you've gone and outsourced your network, your servers, to their outsourced environment. And so this is one where we see oftentimes doesn't 100% get addressed. And so if they don't have a general controls audit or a SOC audit or a similar external audit, like an AT 101 audit done annually, you want to ask them if they do. So we've been harping on this for the last 2 years with our comment in vendor management sections of IT general controls audits, asking for enhanced due diligence on your network support vendors. And you can see they're pointing to it again here. And so if you go out to our website and you hover over services and click on templates, there's a template. It's the first one on the list for enhanced vendor due diligence. If they don't have audits, you'll definitely want to ask them to fill this out, that document out, in addition to the questions we have a little later. And so just simple yes or no, but if it's no, you definitely want to go out and do some enhanced due diligence on that vendor. So do risk assessments include ransomware as a threat? So if your risk assessment right now doesn't list out ransomware as a specific threat, you'll want to get that included in there. So it can be done in one of two ways. The first is find all the critical systems and drop down a new line item for a new risk and put ransomware in for everything. Since the controls are really going to be similar across the board for most of the banks we work with, I would suggest either doing that or just creating one new asset category and calling it ransomware and the risk ransomware, and then describing the controls within there. And so if the answer is no, go out and do it and then change the answer to yes. And then if yes, are we discussing common potential attack vectors? So phishing, watering holes are where a targeted watering hole is where if I'm the attacker and I'm attacking XYZ bank, I get an idea of, through my reconnaissance, of what sites that staff usually visits, and then I go out and compromise those websites or one of those websites in order to compromise the bank. And so the place where they're all going on some basis. And so, but somewhere in the risk assessment, these should be covered, or at a minimum, phishing should be covered, malicious attachments, malicious web links. Usually that's going to be covered under employee personnel as the asset, but however you're doing it, make sure it's covered somewhere in your risk assessment. And then have all ransomware risks and threats identified in the risk assessment been appropriately remedied or mitigated to an acceptable risk level. And so acceptable risk level is going to come down to your board's risk appetite and the bank's risk appetite overall. How much risk are we really willing to accept? And so I would just comment yes or no there. And then number 8 talks about your employee security awareness training programs. And so it goes into 4 different categories there of ransomware, social engineering, and phishing, incident response, and reporting, testing to ensure effective training. And so ransomware is the first. Is there some discussion of ransomware during employee security awareness training? And so it's important to remember again here that ransomware is malware. So if you're talking about malware, you're covering ransomware. And I really can't tell if they're just looking to make sure the word ransomware is included somewhere in there. We feel that at least your employees should know what ransomware is, that it is a type of malware, and then provide some definition of ransomware for that personnel. And so when we look at that board report that we're going to go through, you can take that definition out of there and just make sure that's conveyed to all of your staff. And so, but there should be a focus on malicious websites and downloading malicious attachments. Social engineering and phishing. And so I want you to cover phishing attacks that could happen and other social engineering attacks, how to hover over links and what to look for as far as whether an email is suspicious or not, meaning things like, did we expect this email? Is it coming from someone we know? Is it asking for any unusual? Is it asking for anything out of the ordinary, right? And so those are indicators of a suspicious email. They want you to cover other types of social engineering attacks as well. There are phone attacks out there. There are in-person attacks. A prime example is a pest control attack where an attacker will dress up as pest control or dress up as looking like they're with the fire department and try to enter the facility and physically gain access to servers or a network port or a data port. And so there are USB drop attacks out there. A lot of the banks out there have blocked USB outside of known exceptions, but it's still important to let your staff know that if they find a USB out in the parking lot or in the bathroom or in the lobby or behind a teller line somewhere, not to just plug it in, and make sure they're bringing it to you or the IT person there prior to doing so. There are, no matter what you do as far as blocking a USB storage attack, you're blocking the bulk of the attacks, but there are attacks that have a way around it. So if you Google Rubber Ducky, the Rubber Ducky device, I think it's sold by Hack5. What that does is it mimics a human interface device like a keyboard, and so it's able to bypass those controls. And then incident identification and reporting. So educating your staff about what types of things to look out for to indicate compromise. And so it's usually going to be some type of unusually slow computer or random files deleting, making sure they just know what to look out for, and then also who to report this to. And we would interject in there that you should also have some steps in there, especially if you're in a non-thin client environment, that indicate what they should do if they do see random files deleting or think there's compromise before they call it in to whoever they're supposed to report it to. And we always feel like unplugging the Ethernet cable is the prime way to stop the spread from happening to other devices on the network. And then part of your employee security awareness training program should be also to be doing some testing to ensure effective training. So this could be your annual audit should be including some type of phishing and phone attacks. If you're a larger bank in a bigger city, then maybe in-person attacks as well. A lot of banks have gone in and purchased Know before. We have a number of banks we do quarterly phishing attacks for as well. But this is all to test whether or not the employee training, security training programs and awareness programs are getting through to employees. And so we do suggest at your annual information security training that you let employees know that you will be testing. Honestly, whether or not you're testing or not doesn't matter. We let them know that you will be testing and that hackers don't really have any concept of fairness. The dirtier the attack, their only indication of whether an attack is successful or not successful is if it works. And so however they get there doesn't really matter. And so just a fair warning to employees so that when you do see those attacks come through, they're not coming back to you and say that attack was really unfair. And so fairness doesn't matter. And so just giving them a pre-warning so you don't have to back off on an attack done by an external auditor. So number 9 is where we start kind of digging into some of the questions on specifically the ransomware. And so what I'll note here is they have a section here and it says, if any of this data is managed by an outside vendor, consider asking the vendor to complete the questions. And so if your core processing system is outsourced, what I would do is I would copy questions A through F. I would take those and put them in an email out to that core system vendor and ask them, can you respond to these questions, or can you point inside of your SOC audit or SSAE 18 where these questions are addressed? And so, but if it's in-house, then definitely, you check the boxes where they apply. So are there procedures to prevent backups from being affected by ransomware and malware? So network and core processing. The other critical systems are discussed later on. Access to backup methods. Use authentication methods that differ from network-based authentication methods of authentication. And so you definitely want, there aren't really good compensating controls around this. And so all of your backups at a minimum should be using non-domain credentials, something that's different from an admin on the network. And so something that's different from an account that could be logged on anywhere on the network. What hackers will do to move laterally is they will capture the hash. So let's say you're a network support vendor and you log on to do network support to someone's computer, and then you log off without rebooting. That password, the hash of that password is actually then stored in memory. So what hackers will do once they compromise the system is capture that hash and then pass that hash into other devices to move laterally across the network. So once they come to your backups, that hash shouldn't work because you should be using different authentication than what you're using on the network. Hopefully that makes sense. One other control around that is anytime your network support vendor or you log in with your domain admin credentials, make sure you reboot the machine and so you take those credentials out of memory. Also, at least system versus incremental backups are made. And so they're saying full system on a daily. I don't want to say that seems like overkill. Actually, that seems like quite a bit. And so what we generally see as a good outline on there is that full system backups are either done weekly or they're done monthly. And so with at least incremental being done daily. And so, but again, for the core system and network admin, you'll have a chance to explain your controls a little later. And then at least 2 different backup copies are maintained. Each is stored on different media. So what they're saying is, do we back up to another location? And then do we also back it up to a flash drive or a tape or something? And so, and they're stored separately. And then their next question is at least 1 backup is offline, also known as air-gapped or immutable. And so this is probably the one where it's going to differ between all banks, meaning air-gapping is really hard operationally. And so some banks have gone to the mode where at least once per month, they just have assessed the risk and said, we'll take a backup to tape or a backup to a flash drive or some type of external storage drive, and then completely disconnect that drive from the network. It means remove the Ethernet cable or whatever's connecting it to the backup media. So that way any hack on the network can't jump over the air to that device. And so that's what we call an air-gapped device. Immutable means it's unchangeable. And so if you have like a cloud backup service like Datto or StorageCraft or any of the ones that are out there, you'll have to check with that vendor. But usually once you backed up to the cloud, those backups are considered immutable. And so this is one where you might end up having compensating controls and a logical air gapping occurring. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. And then regular backup testing is performed and is at least annually. So if it's being done, then you want to check yes. So some examples of controls that might be documented in here, you might say network and core system backups, if applicable, are performed daily to another location with a weekly backup that's disconnected from the network. So that weekly backup being disconnected from the network would be your air gapping. And so another control might be backups are segmented with access to backups through port rules. So if you can't do the air gapping, one compensating control is that you segment the backups and then use port rules. So you isolate that it can only be accessed to such and such port. And again, remember, it's using different authentication credentials than what's used out there on the network. And that is time restricted. So if we know our backups are happening between 6 p.m. and 9 p.m. every day, that would be only open for that particular time period. So it's really a logical segregation of backups as a compensating control, potentially to air gapping. So there's still some risk in there, but it's been reduced fairly significantly. And then antivirus protection is on all endpoints, and even better, Next Generation Antivirus Solution is used on all endpoints, or at a minimum on the backup server. So Next Generation Antivirus Solutions, so at SecureGuard, we use CrowdStrike, focus on what we call what they generally refer to as indicators of attack versus indicators of compromise. So if we think about a burglary on a bank or if like a nighttime robbery, you would come in the next morning and you would see cash is missing and the vault door is open. So that would be an indicator of compromise. Versus an indicator of attack, in that same burglary situation, you might have that thief casing the bank at some point and looking at different physical avenues they could attack the bank with. And then on the day of the attack at night, they might come into the bank. The first step might be to disable the alarm system. Their second step might be to go over to the vault and try to brute force in the different combinations. And so those are behaviors, indicators of attack. So next generation antivirus solutions like CrowdStrike or Sophos Intercept X, EDR, there's Cylance, there's Carbon Black Cloud. There's a bunch of different tools out there that are really good at detecting indicators of attack and then blocking the attack before it happens. So the thought process being indicators of compromise is more reactive, whereas indicators of attack is more proactive. And then when you also get into what we're seeing now is a large rise in what we call fileless attacks. And so these are attacks that get stored in memory and run out of memory using PowerShell or some other means. And so normal antivirus solutions will only scan files. And so if there's no file to scan, if the attack is occurring in memory, it might not ever get seen by your antivirus solution. And so we're not saying you have to do this or anything like that, but if you, at least in 2021, if you haven't evaluated a next generation antivirus solution like CrowdStrike or Sophos, Sophos' Intercept X EDR solution, you should at least in 2021 get some demos, talk to your network support vendor, and if they're not offering one, go ahead and go outside of them and get some demos of these products to see what they actually do and evaluate them. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised at the cost differences. Next generation antivirus solution is going to be one that, from what we've seen, the amount of money you pay, you get more out of it. And so another example of a control is backups are replicated off-site. Off-site backups are considered immutable. And so that would be like if you're using Dado or StorageCraft for your cloud-based backups. If you can talk to the vendor and they say that the backups are considered immutable and they have their own proof about that, then you're taken care of there as opposed to the air gapping. And then network and core system backups, if applicable, use non-domain credentials or different credentials than those of domain admin. So that, again, that's what we were talking about earlier, using different credentials than what are used in the network for your backups. And then macro files are blocked by spam filtering. If they're not being blocked by spam filtering, you should look and see and make sure they are. But macro files are one especially early on, one of the primary ways of delivering ransomware attacks. Stripping users of their local administrative capabilities is important. While it's possible to run PowerShell without having admin capabilities, it's much harder. And so most of the attacks that are out there, if you don't have local admin capabilities for that user on their PC, even when they get hit with ransomware, it's going to be harder for them to run those PowerShell, those fileless attacks. And so, also workstation, so make this, and we go back up to gaps when we look at that gap analysis question that they had for the FFIEC CAT tool, there are at least 3 or 4 domain items that require some type of SIEM or Windows log event monitoring. It could be either or. So that would be a gap if you don't have one of those in place. And so spam filter is in place for all incoming email. You have firewalls. So just document your controls. And then number 10, ask further questions. Indicate which of the following preventative controls have been implemented. So RDP. So I know a lot of banks out there have remote desktop protocol implemented. So you want to make sure, one, either it's disabled, or if it's implemented, that it can only be accessed from behind the firewall. So you have to VPN into the bank to access RDP to get to other devices. So this is a question to ask either your network support vendor, or if it's different, your firewall vendor, or whoever is establishing those VPNs and taking care of remote desktop protocol. Then they dig in further to ask about multi-factor authentication and where that's being used. And so their suggestions are by all users that access any cloud-based service. And so MortgageBot is a cloud-based service. So multi-factor authentication should be implemented wherever it's offered and wherever it's possible. And then has it being used for cloud-based email services? So Office 365 is the main one we're seeing. And so multi-factor authentication should either be disabled for those that don't need access to web-based email, and for those that do need access to web-based email, and by that we mean opening a browser and going to the Office 365 login and trying to get your email through the browser. Make sure there's two-factor authentication in place for that. And then on your mobile devices, if they're getting email on the phones, either using an MDM solution or at a minimum, making sure that multi-factor authentication is occurring at least by their default of every 14 days. And then VPN, remote access into the network, is utilizing hardware or soft token, Duo, FortiToken, to VPN into the network. And so they do make a distinction here of using an app for that multi-factor authentication to using an app that generates a security code as opposed to an SMS code. So there's been a large rise in SIM swap attacks where hackers will contact your carrier and swap the SIM from your card to their phone, so they collect that push text notification. So they're suggesting an app that generates a security code. When you look at Office 365, we really haven't seen too many attacks in the SIM swap area around that. But anytime you can use a hardware or a soft token as opposed to that SMS-based authentication, that's going to be ideal. And so here again, it's just talking, you're just checking off what you have, and I would add some commentary behind each. And so, but VPN, you definitely should not be using text-based authentication. And then for at least administrative access. And then eliminated administrative access to endpoints, workstations, and network resources for all but network support personnel, so removing local admin capabilities. Adopted least privileged access concept for granting users access to shared folders and other resources. And so this means that if you have a shared drive to store information out on a server, right, it should only be to your portion of it. Because like a PowerShell ransomware script is going to start cycling through the alphabet to look for different shared drives to go out and encrypt those files on those systems. And so hopefully you have it tightened down to only the things that people need. And then establish process for
provisioning and reviewing Active Directory access, especially for service accounts. So your Scene tool or Windows Log Event Monitoring tool should capture this information. Disabled all unnecessary browser or email client plugins. Check with your network firewall vendor on essentially content filtering, so URL and DNS filtering. Use of IDS and IPS. We'll usually see that at the boundary through your firewall. And this is something we've been harping on for a while is SPF, DKIM, and DMARC. So they're saying that you want the DMARC set to at least quarantine status. And then they're here asking if you're using a behavior-based malware prevention tool. So I've given some examples. And then network segmentation. That could be, you might not, as a community bank, it's going to be really hard to segment the entire network. Some have achieved it, but it's a costly process. And so if anything, at least segment the network backups. So these are all different controls. And then they also go further to ask if ransomware is specifically included as part of the annual incident response test. So one, if you're not doing an incident response test annually, you should. And here are some example scenarios that I've listed out. And I'm probably going to rush through some of this. I think we're running short on time. And so John Doe has downloaded a file containing malware that encrypted his hard drive only versus encrypted his hard drive and all shared map drives. And so designed to get you discussing this. And then they do want to make sure executive management is participating and the CEO at a minimum is participating in that incident response testing annually. And so then they talk about different monitoring practices for servers, workstations, networks, endpoints, etc. And so data loss prevention program, we generally see that in banks that are hitting that $1 billion asset mark. And so we're not going to really see that in most of our community banks. So it's okay to not check something. Remember, risk, this has to be reduced to an acceptable level. And then alerts and blocking of executable files attempting to connect to the internet. Talk to your network support vendor about that. Again, active monitoring of some of these, what they call abusable features, WMI and PSExec or PowerShell. Next Generation Antivirus Solutions are going to be your answer in that case. And there's something that every bank should at least be evaluating this year. Whether you're implementing it or not, it's going to be a decision based on cost. But you should at least get some demos on that. And then there's a section on policy, essentially policy, your incident response plan. So basically, if you don't have these elements in your incident response plan, I would suggest putting a section called ransomware in your incident response plan, or a section called malware, and in parentheses put ransomware included. And then, for example, if you don't have in there that you'll contact legal counsel if there's a breach, or if you have cyber insurance, then I would go and add it to the plan that we will contact legal counsel in the event of a breach, and then check that off. And so I would just go through this. I put some orange notes in here for all of these that will notify all the stakeholders, right? We'll notify all employees and customers. If warranted, contact regulatory agencies. We suggest both state and federal regulatory agencies. But really, if you don't have it in the plan, just make that section and go through this in a checkbox fashion and put it in, and then check these boxes. And then the same thing here with on the recovery side, I would just take these and put them into the plan and say you'll do them. And then if you do have some type of malware or ransomware attack, definitely make sure you're following through with that in some type of document. And this is the section where what we did for core and network, you'll put those other critical systems in here. A lot of them are going to be outsourced. So again, just copy these questions A through F and send them to that network support vendor, and provide some commentary here for what those like MortgageBot or whatever the external vendor is. I'm just using different examples. And so, your spam filtering service, if you're using Zix or Barracuda, ask them these questions and kind of summarize their comments. Or if they're in-house and they're the same as the controls you've identified above, just indicate that as such. If they're not the same, then go through and kind of document what the controls are. And so the other thing really quick that I wanted to go through is the sample board report. And so if I didn't send this out to you, I'm going to resend this out to everybody just in case. just a sample board report. What we suggest is just, on what date that you did the RSAT tool and who was involved in completion of it. Some general definition of ransomware, and so that's kind of what we talked about at the beginning. And then some stats, just so the board is aware of kind of the increase and the impact that this is having and why the regulatory agencies are really starting to kind of highlight it again. And then we'd suggest the current state, right? So kind of summarize the controls we talked about there in question number 9 of, we're using antivirus, we have air gapped, or we don't have air gapped, but we have immutable backups. Whatever we have there, I would summarize some of those controls. And then I would summarize some of the responses you got back from your vendors as well as to how they're protecting your outsourced data, if you have outsourced data. And then some type of write-up or conclusion. So it could be something like, based on the RSAT performed, the bank has implemented adequate controls to mitigate ransomware risk to an acceptable level. Or it could be, while some controls have been implemented, the below additional controls should also be considered. Or it could be something that's more along the lines of, based on the RSAT performed, additional controls should be implemented to adequately mitigate ransomware risk, and then list out those items, and go from there.